Today on Just Curious, we're joined by Amir Ouki, a sharp, commercially minded AI strategist who helps some of the world's biggest companies reimagine how they innovate. As Managing Director of Applied AI at BOI, Amir leads teams building AI native capabilities for clients across consumer goods, healthcare, financial services, and more. He's worked with cutting edge companies like Anthropic, Apple, Palantir, and Airbnb, and he's known for making bold, complex systems actually work at scale. In this conversation, you'll learn how companies are compressing product development from months to days using agentic systems and synthetic consumers, why off-the-shelf AI tools often fall short, and how Amir builds secure IP-owned systems instead, and how to avoid AI theater by anchoring everything in commercial logic and business outcomes. Amir, welcome to Just Curious.
Hey Stu, happy to be here.
You've worked at the intersection of strategy, design, and technology. Can you tell us a little bit more about your journey and what drew you to focus on AI?
Yeah, for sure. So I originally started more on the strategy side of things, more traditional strategy. So working through business strategy, commercial strategy, and brand strategy, and eventually found myself at the software intersection and working in building software at a really great studio called Fictive Kin, and started to really immerse in what strategic technology is. So building systems that are scalable, that are modular, but ultimately that are really solving business challenges, which lent itself obviously very clearly to AI, which I consider to be a highly strategic technology. It's a technology that we can leverage, that we can design, that we can manipulate into solving challenges that were just really, really hard before. So my journey has been somewhat of a organic one through strategy, software, and then eventually merging the two into strategic technology.
Tell us a little bit more about BOI and what you do and who you do it for.
Yeah. So BOI, we have two main areas of focus, which are AI strategy. So broadly helping companies identify when, where, and how to use AI in their organizations. And then the second focus is technology. So thinking about how to build real world AI solutions that are solving real world challenges. And a lot of those different solutions, those different capabilities are usually in the space of augmented decision making, simulation, agentic workflows, as you said earlier, and also starting to do a lot more work now in the field of agentic commerce. So BOI, we are a global company, and I head up America's region over here in our New York office. And we also have a very big Europe market as well, based out of Belgium.
We're going to walk through how BOI helps clients develop end-to-end innovation capabilities and turn signals into products. But I'd love to share a little bit more from your learnings as a setup. And maybe we could start with what to do with AI. So a lot of leaders are being told do something with AI, but they don't know where to start. When you're working with a team, how do you help them define a real business use case and a place to start?
It's really, really important. So whenever we are really doing anything in AI, we always start from the challenge first and not AI. So that ability, that kind of business strategy that I mentioned earlier is really important. You have to know what your challenges are. You have to be able to articulate them. You have to also be able to kind of deconstruct them into sub challenges. And then once you've got a really good sense of what you are trying to solve for, that's the right time to say, okay, what kind of AI technologies will help us solve this? I think we see a lot of people start with the latter, and they'll see AI around or see a specific use case of AI or maybe a specific vendor, and then try and reverse engineer that back into their system. But that's really hard to do. It's always easier, and you're in a better position as a company to say, what are our challenges? What do we need to solve? And then say, okay, how do we need to go out and solve them? So we focus primarily on identification, what are those challenges, and then evaluating them, figuring out essentially what needs to be solved, how it needs to be solved, how we got there, what the right AI technologies could be. And then we think about prioritization, right? So of all these different challenges that we have and all of the different use cases that could emerge from them with AI, how do we prioritize these into impact? How do we think about feasibility? How do we think about what a scalable system starts to look like? And then let that guide what an initial foray could be.
You said in our earlier conversation that growth is back on everyone's mind, but headcount isn't the preferred lever it once was. What kind of problems does AI let companies solve now that they couldn't solve before?
Yeah, I think what we see is to that point, it's an interesting and somewhat tricky market that we're in at the moment when it comes to the economy, and that's very much on the mind of every client that we work with, and it has been for a little while. So a lot of them are approaching AI from the lens of we may not have the budget and the resources to expand our headcount as aggressively as we could previously. So where is there a role for AI in still allowing us to scale the really great talent that we have, but be able to think about how we can augment that. So I think the example that this kind of position you're referencing is what we call the previously impossible, right? So what can we do with AI today that we previously couldn't do? And I think there's different ways to tackle that. One of the big ones is just being able to do a lot more with a huge amount of data is the first one that people usually think of. It was very, very difficult before to, let's say, generate insights or generate signals or assess previous data and figure out patterns from previous data. It was very hard to do that manually, and it's still not extremely easy, but it's much easier than it was before to be able to leverage the data sets that you have, whether structured or unstructured, that just haven't been leveraged before. So the first thing that comes to mind is just the scale of what you can do with AI that you couldn't before by being resource constrained.
I don't want to provide examples that people try and back solve from, but you've worked closely with innovation and transformation and supply chain leaders. Where do you see the biggest opportunities and appetite for AI today?
Yeah, I think that across any function, and we work with different functions and different groups, I think the through line probably is the growth through line. Certainly in the US market, I think there's three different outcomes usually that people are working towards with AI. And the first one is new revenue. How can we use it to generate new revenue, find new segments, find new audiences, launch new products? The second is revenue optimization. So how can we use AI to get more out of the products that we already have in market or the services that we have in market? How do we think about our consumers? How do we think about clustering those consumers? How do we think about marketing? And then the third one, which is usually where people's mind begins, is efficiency and productivity. Right? How do we use AI to automate? How do we use AI to do what we're already doing, but do it in a more efficient way? And I think that even though that third bucket is where people start, usually it's the other two that is driving meaningful investment in building with AI. It's saying, okay, well, actually, if we invest $1 and we can get $2 out of this new capability in terms of new revenue, that's really, really appealing across all functions. And the same for revenue optimization as well. If there's a way that we're able to maximize the growth potential of our existing portfolio of products, it's a really good return compared to just focusing on automation or efficiency or productivity. So while we do work between those different functions that you mentioned, I think that through line is just a drive at the moment for growth and just resiliency in the current market.
And when it comes to that growth, you mentioned revenue optimization, you mentioned new products, segmenting customers in different ways. Without going into too much detail, where are kind of the easiest wins there when it comes to applying AI to drive growth? And I ask because, one, as you noted, it can create more value than just becoming more efficient. Two, it just runs counter to most of the conversations around AI, which are let's become more efficient, which is code for doing more with the same people or the same with fewer. So yeah, curious for your kind of like high level thoughts about when it comes to revenue growth, where are kind of the most interesting opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, as always, it depends on the company, the industry that you're in. And I think just in general with AI, the phrase quick win or easy win is always one I try to avoid because I think there's not too many quick wins when it comes to enterprise AI. Our personal lives and AI in the day-to-day that we use, I think there's so many. But when we think about enterprise AI, there's usually a minimum threshold of kind of engagement needed to get some of that return back. But I think where we tend to see people starting are within the existing portfolio portfolio of products and services that they may have, depending on what kind of company you are. So thinking about how do you win business at the moment? How can you win more of that business? What are the friction points in your sales cycle? And how can you use AI to minimize some of those friction points? So an example that I would give is that we do quite a bit of work in the industrials sector. And there's a really interesting specific use case around quoting that we see with a lot of manufacturing companies that we work with, where they just have really slow quoting times or really slow turnaround times when they're working with different OEMs and different clients. It's one that AI does lend itself pretty well to. It's a common thread. It's not the most complicated problem to solve, but it does involve a level of customization, given that every company's quoting process is different. If I were to just call out an example of something that comes to mind that is a relatively, for want of a better phrase, quick hit when it comes to revenue driving. Something like that is I think, a good example. Just something as simple as quoting and turnaround times and how different companies are able to get proposals out the door. We've heard of proposals from manufacturing companies sometimes taking 6 weeks to reach the client, which by that point obviously is somewhat compromising the revenue potential.
Yeah. Interesting. Many teams start with off-the-shelf tools, and certainly when it comes to enterprise adoption, whether it's enterprise licenses of your kind of model of choice, that was the first step. Why do they often fall short, and how do you help these teams build custom solutions that actually scale?
Yeah, the buy versus build question is it's a really tricky one. There is no right or wrong is the first thing that we always say. Build is not always right. Buy is not always right. We ourselves are not affiliated with any vendors. So we I think have a strong neutral position, and we're constantly assessing different tools and different vendors and different SaaS solutions out there. I think where we've seen SaaS starts to break, certainly at the enterprise level, is twofold. One is the data question. We work with a lot of companies that just are not in a position to let their data leave their own environment, let alone go off into a SaaS tool. This is the case with every Fortune 500 company that we work with. There's just no chance that they're using an external SaaS tool and putting their data into it. So what they're ultimately able to do if they do use a vendor is to just be able to use it as an outsider. They're not able to actually leverage that data, so they don't get so much value out of it. So one is the data security question, and the second is the customization. And whenever we're building any kind of AI capability, it really is designed with that team in mind. So we're thinking about what is the specific commercial logic that is relevant to that team. We're also thinking about how do they work right now? What is their existing process? What makes them really strong? What are the blockers individually that they have, and how can we unblock those obstacles in whatever we're building for them? So that level of, I guess, customization is probably the word you just can't get with different SaaS tools. So those are the two big blockers that I would say that prevent at least the clients that we work with from being able to meaningfully engage with. But I think for smaller companies, there's a really interesting opportunity there, and it just doesn't make sense for a lot of them to be building that kind of platform from the ground up.
Yeah. Do you think AI is different than prior technology shifts with respect to its enablement of a startup ecosystem? I ask because there are thousands of AI startups, but to your point, for many companies, a off-the-shelf startup solution is not going to work, whether it's, data or something else. Do you think AI is just different and that these startups are going to have a harder time? You've heard about, as an example, agentic startups transitioning, let's call it, to more of a service provider model. Curious for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So just kind of a caveat, we don't do too much work as BOI in the startup space itself, but I'll say just kind of as an observer, I think that it is going to be a tricky market for a lot of the AI startups that have emerged in the last year or two. I do think that it'll end up likely being a winner takes all situation, as with software all the time. So I think a lot of the startups are going to struggle. I think likely one of their biggest competitors is not going to be each other. It's going to be internal teams. I think that where they will struggle is just companies building some version of these capabilities themselves. So as we kind of democratize access to building tools, both for people that don't have technical teams, but companies that do have technical teams already, it just is a lot easier for them to stand up at least an MVP version of what a lot of the SaaS companies out there are doing. That's certainly not all of them, and this is definitely just a hunch, and I think it's so important to have a healthy ecosystem, but I do think it's going to be choppy waters potentially.
Let's talk about agents for a minute. What do you mean when you talk about agentic reasoning systems, and
Mm.
how do they fit into and help transform enterprise workflows?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we think of the whole agent sphere as being much more of a spectrum, and there was definitely a moment in time, I would say, around a year ago, maybe even 6 months ago, where agents were very much on everyone's minds, and I think that there was almost kind of a land grab for who could define what an agent was. And just heard all these different definitions of what an agent really is. It needs to be autonomous. It needs to be self-hosted. It was kind of a marketing frenzy around agents, but the way that we think about it is less the individual entity itself. So when I think of when people tend to reference an agent, they're usually thinking of some kind of defined entity that is acting in some kind of defined environment. And it could be something like a chatbot for customer service or a research assistant, for example. But I think for us, when we're thinking about the value of an agentic system, we think a bit more from the reasoning standpoint. So almost a spectrum of autonomy where you can have agents that are very much running on predefined paths, and you can have agents that are running on paths that are less defined. I don't think we're anywhere near the point of autonomous agents at the moment, and I'm not sure what the future for that would look like, but we think of agentic reasoning as basically what is that process, what's that capability by which multiple agents or a system of agents can make decisions, can deconstruct problems, can evaluate outcomes, and coordinate actions. So that for us is the reasoning process, and then that gets applied basically to any challenge that we're trying to solve. We could be using that kind of setup to figure out what a new signal can be in this giant trove of social listening data. It could be that we are using this kind of agentic setup for scenario modeling or to do more complex simulation. So really it's fairly agnostic in where it lives, but that's how we think of it versus just your agent that you may see from maybe a big tech company or a lot of the marketing that you see out there at the moment.
Yeah. I want to show viewers and listeners more of how you work. We talked earlier about a example of working with a CPG company to help them build kind of end-to-end innovation capabilities going from signal to product. Can you walk us through that process?
Yeah.
Where do you start?
Yeah, so I think it's good a good use case example maybe to show a flow of what a typical project works with, although none of them are particularly typical. But we have worked with a lot of companies, especially in CPG, where the end-to-end new product development capability is a huge part of the business, and it's also a very complex part of the business. So we've been actually building AI capabilities that will run that entire process really end-to-end with the existing new product development team. And that could be an innovation team, it could be an R&D team. Oftentimes it's sometimes sales and marketing teams that are running the go-to-market portion of this process. It's generally a collaborative kind of inter-team capability, but it can start with innovation or transformation usually. But we are essentially using AI to start with a signal and different sets of signals. So we'll take internal data, we'll take external data out there in the world. We'll take third-party data, meaning data that one of these companies is already purchasing or has purchased or has a license agreement from one of their vendors. We take all of that, and then we'll use essentially AI systems to generate opportunity spaces from those, well, generate insights from those, then turn those insights into opportunity spaces, and then start to really ideate and concept and think about what could new products look like? What could new services look like? What could new business models look like, for example? And then take those and then rigorously test them. Again, through simulation, through really rigorous synthetic testing, and we'll use that agentic reasoning approach that I mentioned earlier to figure out, okay, does this meet desirability requirements? Does this meet feasibility requirements? Does this meet viability requirements? And doing that end to end, you can get from a set of just raw data that's out there in the world to a really refined final concept. It could be for a new product. It could be an adjustment on an existing product. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just new product development or innovation. It can be your existing portfolio, but you can get from that signal to launch really, really fast. And it's just been very empowering, I think, for a lot of the teams that we've been working with to be able to take a process that typically would have taken them a lot of manual work over 6, 8 months and be able to get to really validated new product development much, much faster. And then what we see for those roles is that they're actually able to spend a lot more time now prototyping it and making it real and testing it with real people instead of spending so much time on the funnel process where a lot of the ideas ultimately I'm invested in ideas that are not ready to go to market. It's been a really fun capability. We've done it quite a bit for companies, actually in many different sectors.
For people who have not done that with you before, you mentioned you're able to compress the sort of the calendar from 6 to 8 months to something much shorter. Understanding everything is different for each individual situation and client. Like approximately how much compression can one expect from using a AI powered process like this?
Depending on what the process looks like, it's very different for different folks. So we design it, we build it in a different way for each of the teams we work with. We have some teams that really will lean into functionality like forecasting or opportunity sizing. We have other teams that are more interested in functionality like turning those concepts into factory ready production specs. So just for context, it can live and express in different ways, but I'd say end to end, it comes down to just a couple of days.
Mm,
Just a
wow.
pretty substantial change.
Yeah. You mentioned synthetic consumers and customers. What does that mean?
So essentially what we're doing is that we are replicating the behaviors, the intrinsic motivations, especially of traditional consumers. So we are trying to get them as close as possible to a set of sometimes personas, sometimes archetypes that oftentimes companies may have to start with. They may have really rigorous persona data. They may have incomplete persona data, which we're enriching with AI. But essentially what we're trying to do is we're mirroring real human behaviors as closely as we can. So it's the behaviors and it's the intrinsic motivators as well that are behind those behaviors.
What do you say to people who push back and say, but these aren't real?
I think that's very correct. It absolutely is not real. And one of the first things that we always say is that the outcome of this is to get as close as we can to winning ready services and concepts. Ideas that will perform really well in market and get you as close as possible. There's always a human in the loop, and there will always be a human making the decisions throughout this process and saying, okay, this is what we want to explore further. This is what we might put into physical prototyping. And a lot of the time, our clients will say, okay, great. We've got 3 winning concepts here. Let's put this in the hands of real consumers, which is important. We actually have one client that hasn't done that and quite literally ships these concepts straight to factories and tests them in market from the get-go. So it's going straight to a factory. It's then getting deployed straight to 3 or 4 stores. It's a retail client, and they'll get a sense in those stores of how the product is performing with real actual purchase data. Have people bought this or not? If they have, then this is a good signal for us to expand this to other stores. But that's an exception. For everyone else, it does end up in the hands of real consumers. And for now, I would advise that continues. So the goal is not to replace consumers entirely. The goal is how can we get to, winning.
Any other challenges, whether technical or cultural or strategic, that you face when deploying these kind of systems?
There are many, many different challenges that are involved in just AI in general. The obvious one is thinking about data scalability. We always approach building anything from an MVP approach, your kind of traditional start small, focus on just proving out the key hypotheses. And a lot of our clients are multi-brand clients, so they'll have a lot of household names. We'll say, let's pick one and let's test out this capability on just this one brand or this one category within the business. But we always say start with a POC, prove out the value first, and then build it in a way that is scalable, that is modular, that is able to expand beyond that. So that's for us. Again, there are many different challenges. That's been for us the most effective way of being able to navigate some of those some of those scalability challenges. I'd say just from a behavioral perspective, it's a big shift in ways of working. And there's definitely an enablement, a change management aspect of this that maybe doesn't present itself in the early stages when you're building a POC or an MVP or even a V1 or a V2 of this capability. But you do get to a point where it has started to become so embedded in the ways of working that change management is important, whether it's our clients needing that, whether it's us leading that, whether it's someone else leading that. It's something I want to make sure we don't skip over because it is important as this scales.
As we come to a close, what's a mindset shift that you think unlocks the most value when it comes to AI?
That's a good question. I think if I were to pick one, I would say to move away from kind of ChatGPT thinking. And I think ChatGPT has been both a boon and a curse for AI because it's a very specific interaction in a very specific format that is somewhat linked to a behavior that we're very much trained into already, which is kind of your Google behavior. Hey, I want to know something. I'm going to ask a question. And it's been so helpful for so many things in a day to day. I use it a lot. I plan all my vacations around with ChatGPT. I use it for recipes. I use it a lot. From an enterprise perspective, what it's done is it has a little bit, I think, trained some people to think of enterprise AI as kind of like that, like a chatbot, like a way to answer questions. And it's a little bit ingrained that kind of interaction, when I think what is more helpful is to think of AI as a way to improve your decision making. We make so many decisions in any role, in any function, at any seniority level every single day. And for us, what we're looking for is, of all those decision nodes, how can we use AI to make as many of them more effective as possible? How can we get closer to the right decision in as many cases as we can? And that for us is what is really interesting. That augmented decision making is that's the kind of compounding unlock of AI, at least at the enterprise level. So I think one of the behavior shifts is just getting more comfortable with that. And part of that is just adoption and education and the growth of the industry.
For those listening and wondering whether BOI could be a fit for their business, who's the right partner to you, whether it's a vertical, whether it's an office or a business unit, whether it's a size? Who's a good fit for BOI?
Yeah. So we work primarily in the consumer goods, the food and bev, financial services, healthcare, and the industrials space. I would say that mostly we work in mid-market and large enterprises. So those are the size ranges that we are most effective for. Generally, companies in that realm that are either more advanced with AI and are thinking about how do we turn this into compounding AI system? How do we take all these different pilots that we have and turn this into something scalable and systemized is a really great conversation for us to have, but also people that just have not done anything with AI. There's not too many out there now at the company level, but folks that are also much earlier in their adoption journey, we do a lot of work with as well.
Amazing. Amir, thank you for coming on to Just Curious and sharing your perspectives on AI and how enterprises can hopefully use it to create a compounding machine and more value in the future.
Thanks, dude. I appreciate it. Thanks.